We're starting in section 2.3. We're starting with 2.3a, of course. We're going to be looking at graphing these equations. So we're still looking at linear lines, so these are all still straight lines, so linear lines. They all have just the two variables. They all have one input with one domain, so these are all going to be functions that we're looking at. They're not in function notation, so you can't 100% say that every single one's going to be a function, but I can tell you that they're going to be functions. Okay, so we'll look at and just going through and doing a little bit of solving here. So this number one is kind of like a literal equation. When we were doing literal equations and we had to solve for a variable, we had a couple different variables in there. Well, in this case, we've got an x and a y, and we want to solve for this y. And this is really just a nice friendly equation. I have a two-step equation here. In order to solve for the y, I have to get rid of the 2x and I have to get rid of the 3. Okay? And I do this first and this second. So I get rid of the x first and then the number in front second. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides and I get 3y equals. Now I could either do 12 minus 2x, okay, or negative 2x plus 12. I'm going to do negative 2x plus 12, and I'll show you why as we go into our next section. Okay, but right now, I just want you to put the x first. Okay, so if it's got a negative in front, it's negative 2x plus 12. So then I'm going to divide by 3 to get the y by itself. And the 3's cancel over here, so I get y equals, this is negative 2/3 in front of the x, so I'm going to leave it as negative 2/3. I do not want to turn that into a decimal. Do not do the decimal. And then 12 divided by 3, that's 4. So here is my equation solved for y. Now hopefully you remember that what this kind of is when we were thinking of graphing. This was y equals mx plus b. But we'll get more into that later. But I want the x's to be first, and then the constants to be at the end, because it's going to help us later as we go ahead and graph these. So now number 2 and number 3, we're going to actually solve the equation for y, which is the same thing we just did. But then we're also going to add the graphing portion on here. Okay? And if you notice, number 2 and number 3 actually are the same equation, because I'm going to show you the graphing part in two different ways. Okay? So the solving is going to be the same. I'm going to subtract 2x. So I get 4y equals negative 2x plus 8, and divide by 4, divide by 4, divide by 4. I get y equals, I can reduce this fraction to negative 1/2, and then 8 divided by 4 is 2. Well, that's the same exact thing that's going to happen over here in problem number 3. Okay, and so I'm not going to waste my time. I'm just telling you that they're going to be the same equation. Okay, so now when I look at problem number 2, I want to go ahead and I want to graph this. So I've got some places for x's. Remember, x's were the domain. Those were the numbers that we could choose as the independent variable or the input of this equation. And then when I plug it in, it's going to come back and give me some sort of an output. Okay? Now I can choose any numbers that I want for the x's. Okay? But in this particular case, I'm going to, when I plug it in, okay, let's say that I choose a 1. If I plug it in, I get y equals negative 1/2 times 1 plus 2. Okay, when I do that, I get negative 1/2 times 1. Well, that leaves me with a fraction. Okay, so if I want to be a little more strategic about this, I can say, well, I'm going to take half of this number, so I might as well use some numbers that are even, because when I plug it in, it's pretty easy to do half of 2, okay, and then add the 2. So if I use even numbers, that's going to be more beneficial to this coming out to be kind of nice. Okay? So let's just do the work for that in case you were wondering what's actually happening here with this y value. So negative 1/2 times negative 2, negative times negative is a positive. Half of 2 is 1. 1 plus 2 is 3. So my ordered pair here was negative 2, because that was the x that I plugged in, and the 3 is what I got back. Okay, so let's go ahead and choose 0. Negative 1/2 times 0 plus 2. Well, negative 1/2 times 0 is 0. 0 plus 2 is 2, so I get 0 comma 2. Okay, now I'm going to plug in. Let's plug in. Again, we want to choose even numbers, so let's plug in a 2. So negative 1/2 times 2 plus 2. Well, let's see what happens when I do that. Negative 1/2 times 2 plus 2. That's negative 1. Half of 2 is still 1. Negative times a positive makes a negative. Plus 2. Negative 1 plus 2, opposite signs, different signs, subtract. So 2 minus 1 is 1. Keep the sign of the bigger one. That's a positive. So 2 comma 1 is what we get here. Now, there's a fourth place on here that then I want to go ahead and choose another number to plug in here. So I get y equals negative 1/2 times 4 plus 2. Do that work down here. Y equals negative 1/2 times 4 plus 2. Half of 4 is 2. So negative times a positive is negative 2 plus 2. Negative 2 plus 2 is 0. So I end up with 4 comma 0 for that point. And so I end up with some nice ordered pairs that I'm going to graph here in a second. So then the question is, well, why do I have two of these problems on here? And here's the reason why. Because you could choose to do that. Okay, you can choose to solve the equation for y, and the directions actually tell you on this one to solve the equation for y. But when you're going about graphing, I want you to know that there's other options for you. Okay, where in this particular problem, you need to solve to figure out what y is, which means that you're actually plugging x values in. So let's take a look here at number 3, and let's say that you didn't want to solve the equation for y to begin with. Let's say that you wanted to solve the equation for y after you did some work. So you're going to take the same numbers that we had here, negative 2, 0, 2, and 4, and you're going to plug them in to the equation. So you're going to take and you're going to plug them in as 2 times negative 2 plus 4y equals 8. Okay, so I plug it into the equation, so I get 2 times negative 2 plus 4y equals 8. And I want to solve for the equation after I plug the number in. So I want to solve for y after I plugged it in. Well, you could do that, okay? And you're still following the directions technically. The direction said solve the equation for y. Well, that's really what we're going to do here. So now I add 4 to both sides, and I get 4y equals 12, divide by 4, and y is equal to 3. Okay, and I solved for y. So my x value is negative 2, my y value is 3. Look at what happens when I plug the 0 in. So I get 2 times 0 plus 4y equals 8. 2 times 0 is 0 plus 4y equals 8, which really is just 4y equals 8. I didn't have to move anything. Divide by 4, and y is equal to 2. So I end up with 0 comma 2. By the way, I plugged this in here like that. Then I could go on and I can do the red one. So 2 times 2 plus 4y equals 8. 2 times 2 plus 4y equals 8. 2 times 2 is 4 plus 4y equals 8. Subtract 4 from both sides. 4y equals 4. Divide by 4. Divide by 4. And y is equal to 1. So I ended up with 2 comma 1. And finally, I plug in the 4, so I get 2 times 4 plus 4y equals 8. 2 times 4 plus 4y equals 8. This is 8 plus 4y equals 8. Subtract 8 from both sides. 4y equals 0. Divide by 4. I get y is equal to 0. I solved for y, so I ended up with 4 comma 0. Now, we did the same exact equation, so your ordered pairs should match up from the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Okay, and they do. Problem number 2 and problem number 3, they should be exactly the same, and they are. And well, we're doing the same problem. We're just doing it in a different way. And so you could choose either to solve the equation first, and then go ahead and plug the numbers in, which we did in number 2, or you could plug the numbers in and then go ahead and solve the equation for y in the second step. Okay, and so either one of those are just fine. Now, just a reminder of how you graph these. So they're both going to be the same, so we're going to graph them just on one graph here. So I go negative 2 on the x value, on the x, and 3 on the y. So I go negative 2 comma 3 should be right here. I get 0 comma 2, so 0 on the x and 2 on the y. I have 2 comma 1, so 2 on the x and 1 on the y. And then 4 comma 0, which is 4 on the x and 0 on the y. So then my line looks like this, and hopefully you draw a straighter line than I just did. But that's our final equation. Okay, so we're solving the equations for y, and then either you can solve the equation first and plug numbers in, or you can plug numbers in and then solve the equation when you're going about graphing them. Okay, so take your time on this. Make sure you're asking questions as you're going along.